The city was eerily quiet, its once bustling streets now a graveyard of broken windows and rusting cars. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of buildings, carrying the faint scent of decay. Richard moved cautiously, his boots crunching against the debris-strewn pavement. Every step was calculated, every corner a potential threat. The old apartment complex stood like a crumbling monument to a life long gone. Richard pushed the door open, the creak of the rusted hinges echoing through the dark hallway. He gripped the worn stock of his rifle tightly, scanning the shadows for movement. His mind, however, was elsewhere, locked in a memory that haunted him. Anna's laughter. It was distant now, like a song played underwater. He tried to cling to it, to the warmth of her voice, but the weight of her absence was suffocating. She was gone, and the world felt emptier because of it. A faint noise snapped him back to reality, a muffled thud coming from the floor below. Instinctively, he raised his rifle and crept down the staircase, each step careful and deliberate. The sound grew clearer as he approached an old corner store. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, amidst overturned shelves and scattered cans, was a girl. She was crouched near the back, rummaging through a pile of debris. Her clothes were torn, her arms marked with shallow scratches. She couldn't have been more than 12. Richard froze. The girl turned, her eyes wide with fear. She clutched a tin can to her chest, like it was her last lifeline. For a moment, neither of them moved. "It's okay," Richard said, lowering his rifle. His voice was rough, unused to gentleness. "I'm not here to hurt you." The girl hesitated, her small frame trembling. I didn't steal anything," she stammered. "I was just looking for food." Richard stared at her, his heart sinking. Her voice, her fear, it all felt too familiar. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled pack of crackers. He held it out to her, his movements deliberate. "Here," he said. "You need it more than I do. What's your name?" She hesitated again before taking the crackers. "Lila," she said, her voice barely audible. "Lila," Richard repeated, as if anchoring the name in his mind. He glanced around the ruined store. "This place isn't safe. You shouldn't be here alone. I don't have anywhere else to go," she replied, her gaze dropping to the floor. Richard took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing on him. He had spent so long avoiding people, shutting himself off from the world. But something about Lila, vulnerability in her eyes, the way she reminded him of honest stirred something he thought he'd lost. "Come on," he said finally. "I'll help you, but we need to move now." Lila hesitated but eventually nodded, clutching the crackers tightly. Richard turned toward the door, his grip tightening on his rifle. The world outside was cruel and unforgiving, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. The air outside was cold and biting, the kind that seeped through your skin and settled deep in your bones. Richard led the way, keeping Lila close, but not too close. The streets were a labyrinth of overturned vehicles, shattered glass, and silence. Every step felt like a gamble, every shadow a potential threat. Lila followed quietly, her small frame dwarfed by the rifle slung across Richard's back. She didn't ask questions, and Richard didn't offer explanations. He preferred it. That way, less talking, less attachment. But he couldn't help glancing back every now and then, making sure she was still there. "How long have you been out here?" Richard asked finally, breaking the silence. His voice startled even himself. Lila hesitated. "A while," she said. "I lost everyone." The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Richard didn't press further. He knew what loss felt like, how it hollowed you out until there was nothing left but the ache. They came to a narrow alleyway, its walls covered in peeling graffiti and ivy. Richard motioned for Lila to stop, raising a hand to signal silence. He scanned the area, his eyes sharp and practiced. Years of survival had taught him to listen for the subtle cues, the scrape of a shoe against concrete, the faint rustle of movement. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice low but firm. "I'll check ahead." Lila nodded, her eyes wide with both fear and trust. Richard moved forward, his rifle raised, his senses on high alert. The alley opened into a small courtyard, littered with broken furniture and empty bottles. For a moment, it seemed safe, and then he heard a faint gut sound like something struggling to breathe. Richard froze, his finger tightening on the trigger. The sound grew louder, closer. He turned toward the source and saw it, a man, or what used to be a man. The thing's body was hunched and twisted, its skin marred by grotesque growths of pale, flower-like structures. The petals quivered, releasing a faint, powdery mist into the air. The creature moved with a jerky, unnatural rhythm, its head snapping toward Richard as if sensing his presence. Richard didn't wait. He fired a single shot, the crack of the rifle shattering the silence. The creature collapsed in a heap, the mist lingering in the air like a ghost. "Richard." Lila's voice came from behind him, small and trembling. "Stay back," he barked, turning to see her standing at the edge of the alley. "Don't breathe it in." Lila froze, her eyes darting to the fallen creature. "What is that?" she whispered. "Trouble," Richard muttered, wiping his brow. "Let's move. Now." He grabbed Lila's arm, pulling her away from the courtyard. His mind raced, memories clawing their way to the surface. He had seen this before: the flowers, the mist. He had lost everything to it as they disappeared into the maze of streets. Richard couldn't shake the feeling that the past was catching up to him, and this time, it wasn't just his life on the line. The wind howled through the ruins, carrying with it the faint scent of decay and something else, something sweeter, like rotting flowers. Richard and Lila moved quickly, weaving through the wreckage of the city. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on shattered concrete. "Richard," Lila finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What was that thing back there? Why was it like that?" Richard didn't answer immediately. His mind was still replaying the scene, the quivering petals, the mist hanging in the air. He had seen it before, long ago, but talking about it meant digging up memories he had spent years trying to bury. "It's the flowers," he said at last. "They grow inside you, take over. Once they do, you're not you anymore." Lila frowned, clutching the straps of her tattered backpack. "Is it a disease?" "Something like that," Richard replied, his tone curt. "Doesn't matter what it is. What matters is staying alive." Lila fell silent again, but Richard could feel her questions pressing against the air between them. He couldn't blame her. The world had become a nightmare, and no one ever bothered to explain why. They reached an abandoned building, its windows boarded up and its doors hanging loosely on their hinges. Richard motioned for Lila to stop as he pushed the door open, his rifle at the ready. The inside was dark and stale, but it seemed safe for now. "This'll do for the night," he said, lowering his weapon. "Find a spot to sit. Stay quiet." Lila obeyed, settling into a corner of the room. Richard set his rifle down and began unpacking his bag, pulling out a can of beans and a rusted can opener. He handed the opened can to Lila without a word. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice small. Richard leaned against the wall, his eyes scanning the room. It was second nature, now always watching, always listening. But his gaze kept drifting back to Lila. She was young, too young to be alone in a world like this. And yet, there she was, eating quietly, trying not to make a sound. "Where's your family?" Richard asked, his voice softer than he intended. Lila froze, the can halfway to her mouth. She set it down and hugged her knees to her chest. "Gone," she said finally. "They didn't make it." Richard didn't press further. He knew the pain in her voice, the hollow look in her eyes. It was the same pain that had haunted him since he lost Anna. "We'll keep moving tomorrow," he said. After a long silence, "Find somewhere safer." "Safer?" Leela scoffed, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. "There's no such thing anymore." Richard couldn't argue with that. The world was broken, and safety was nothing more than an illusion. But he wasn't about to give up. Not yet. As the night deepened, Lila fell asleep, her small frame curled up in the corner. Richard sat awake, his rifle across his lap. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and dance, but it wasn't the darkness that kept him awake. It was the weight of responsibility, the realization that, for the first time in years, someone was counting on him. He glanced at Lila, her face soft and peaceful in sleep. For a moment, he saw Anna there, her laughter echoing faintly in his mind. He shook the thought away, gripping his rifle tighter. "I won't fail this time," he muttered to himself, his voice low and firm. Not again. The faint light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, casting long shadows across the room. Richard hadn't slept. His back ached from leaning against the cold wall, but his eyes never left the doorway. The faintest sound could mean death or worse. Leela stirred, groaning softly as she woke. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and looked over at Richard. "You didn't sleep?" she asked, her voice still groggy. "No time for that," Richard replied curtly. "We move as soon as you're ready." She nodded, pulling on her worn boots, and slinging her bag over her shoulder. As they stepped outside, the world felt unnaturally still. Richard's instincts screamed at him something wasn't right. The air was thicker, heavier, and the faint scent of flowers lingered in a way that made his skin crawl. "What's wrong?" Lila asked, noticing his sudden stillness. "Quiet," he hissed, scanning the street. His eyes fell on a small garden, just a few feet away, overrun with white flowers. The petals shimmered faintly in the morning light, their edges curling as if they were alive. Richard's stomach churned. "Don't breathe too deeply," he warned. "Stay close and don't touch anything." They moved cautiously, weaving through the ruins and avoiding the clusters of flowers that seemed to be spreading more aggressively than he remembered. Richard's mind raced. This wasn't normal. The blooms were thriving, taking over the streets, like a disease. Leela, walking just a step behind, gasped softly, "Richard ... look." He turned to see her pointing at a building across the street. The windows were shattered, and inside, vines thick with flowers crept up the walls, weaving through the rubble like veins. But it wasn't the vines that made Richard's blood run cold. It was the figure standing among them, a woman or what was left of one. Her body was covered in the same grotesque growths Richard had seen the day before, her face barely recognizable beneath the mass of petals. She stood unnaturally still, her head tilted as if listening to something only she could hear. "Is she alive?" Leela whispered, her voice trembling. "No," Richard said firmly, "not anymore." As if on cue, the woman's head snapped toward them. The flowers on her body quivered, releasing a fine mist into the air. She let out a guttural scream, a sound that echoed through the empty streets and sent a chill down Richard's spine. "Run," he barked, grabbing Lila's arm and pulling her down the street. The woman or creature lurched forward, moving with an unnatural speed. The vines in the building behind her seemed to come alive, crawling toward the windows as if trying to follow. Richard fired a shot over his shoulder, but it only slowed her down for a moment. "This way," he shouted, leading Lila into a narrow alleyway. The walls were covered in graffiti and grime, but it offered a brief reprieve from their pursuer. "Why? Didn't the shot stop her?" Lila panted, her voice laced with panic. "The flowers," Richard said grimly. "They're not just growing, they're controlling, and they're getting smarter." Lila's eyes widened, fear flashing across her face. "How do we stop them?" Richard didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. For years, he had avoided the flowers, avoided the infected. But now, they were spreading faster, growing stronger, and for the first time, he felt truly outmatched. They emerged from the alley into a small clearing, where an old gas station stood in ruins. Richard motioned for Leela to follow him inside. It wasn't safe, but it was better than the open street. "We'll figure it out," he said finally, though the words felt hollow. He glanced at Leela, her small frame trembling with exhaustion and fear. "We always do." The gas station was eerily silent, the kind of silence that made every creak and rustle feel deafening. Richard secured the door with a broken piece of shelving, though he knew it wouldn't hold for long if the infected found them. Lila sat on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, her breathing still shallow from the chase. "You okay?" Richard asked, his voice softer now. She nodded, but didn't look at him. "What happens if we can't outrun them?" Richard didn't answer right away. He didn't want to lie, but the truth was something neither of them could afford to hear right now. Instead, he crouched down, resting his rifle across his lap. "They're not unbeatable," he said. "We just have to stay one step ahead." Leela finally looked up, her eyes brimming with unspoken questions. "How do you know so much about them?" Richard hesitated. He had been running from his past for so long, but now it felt like it was catching up to him with every step. He sighed, leaning back against the wall. "Because I've seen this before," he admitted. "A long time ago, before the cities fell apart. I worked with a group of scientists, soldiers. We were supposed to stop it before it spread." "What happened?" Leela pressed, her voice barely above a whisper. "We failed," Richard said simply. "We thought we could control it, study it. But the flowers, they were smarter than we realized. They adapt, grow faster, spread through the air, through touch. We didn't stand a chance." Leela frowned, her brow furrowing. "But why? What caused it?" Richard shook his head. "No one knows for sure. Some said it came from the soil. Others thought it was some kind of experiment gone wrong. All I know is that once it takes hold, there's no going back." A heavy silence fell between them. Lila's gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers tracing the frayed edges of her sleeves. Richard could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else there, too, determination. "So, what do we do now?" she asked. Richard stood, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "We keep moving. There's a place north of here, an old research station. If there's any chance of finding answers, it's there." Leela hesitated, then stood as well. "And if there aren't any answers?" Richard met her gaze, his expression grim but resolute. "Then we figure out a way to survive, like we always do." They left the gas station as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ruins. The air was heavy with the scent of flowers, and every step felt like a gamble. But for the first time in years, Richard wasn't running alone. As they moved north, the world around them seemed to grow quieter, more still. The flowers were everywhere now, creeping up the sides of buildings and stretching across the pavement like a web. Richard kept his rifle at the ready, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. "Richard," Lila said suddenly, her voice tense. She pointed to the side of the road, where a large sign stood covered in vines. Beneath the foliage, the faded words were barely visible. "Restricted area. Quarantine zone." Richard's jaw tightened. The research station was close, but so were the answers he had been avoiding for years. He glanced at Leela, who was staring at him with a mix of fear and trust. "This is it," he said quietly. "Whatever we find in there, it's not going to be easy." Lila nodded, her small hand gripping the strap of her backpack tightly. "I'm ready." Richard wasn't sure if he believed her or himself. But as they stepped past the sign and into the overgrown wasteland beyond, he knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back. The quarantine zone was a labyrinth of decay. Overgrown vines covered every surface, winding their way through rusted fences and crumbling buildings. The air was thick, heavy with the sweet, suffocating scent of the flowers. Richard led the way, his rifle at the ready, while Lila followed close behind. her eyes darting nervously at every shadow. The research station loomed ahead, a hulking structure partially swallowed by the creeping vegetation. Its once sterile walls were now cracked and stained with time, the windows shattered like empty eyes, staring into the void. Richard hesitated at the entrance, his gut twisting with a sense of foreboding. "We're here," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Leela glanced at him, her brow furrowed. "You've been here before, haven't you?" Richard nodded slowly. "A long time ago." Inside, the air was colder, staler, as if the building itself had been holding its breath. The faint hum of old machinery echoed through the halls, accompanied by the occasional creak of shifting metal. Richard moved cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. They reached a large room filled with broken monitors and overturned desks. Richard's eyes scanned the walls, where faded maps and notes still clung, pinned by rusted tacks. He stepped closer, brushing off the dust from one of the maps. It was a diagram of the flowers, their structure, their growth patterns. The words, Phase 3 development, were scrawled in bold letters across the top. "What is this place?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. "This is where it started," Richard said quietly. "The flowers. They weren't natural. They were made." Lila's eyes widened. "Made? By who?" Richard clenched his jaw, his gaze fixed on the diagram. "By us. A team of scientists. My team. We thought we were creating something revolutionary, a way to enhance human capabilities, to make us stronger, faster. But the flowers, they evolved faster than we could control. They turned on us." Lila took a step back, her hands trembling. "You mean, this is your fault?" Richard didn't respond immediately. The weight of her accusation hit him harder than he expected. "I didn't plant them," he said finally. "But I didn't stop them either." Before Lila could respond, a low, guttural sound echoed through the hall. Richard froze, his rifle snapping up instinctively. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the faint rustle of vines. "Stay behind me," he hissed, moving toward the source of the noise. They turned a corner and froze. The hallway ahead was overrun with flowers, their petals shimmering faintly in the dim light. In the center of the bloom stood a figure, its body grotesquely twisted, almost unrecognizable as human. The flowers growing from its skin pulsed rhythmically, as if alive. But what made Richard's blood run cold was the face. Beneath the petals and growths, he recognized it. A colleague, someone he had worked with, laughed with, trusted. "Dr. Hensley," Richard whispered, his voice breaking. The creature turned its head sharply, the flowers on its body quivering. It let out a piercing screech, and the vines around it began to move, slithering toward Richard and Lila like living things. "Run," Richard shouted, grabbing Lila's arm and pulling her back down the hallway. They sprinted through the station, the sound of vines tearing through metal and concrete close behind. Richard's mind raced, the reality of what he had seen crashing down on him. This wasn't just an experiment gone wrong, it was a betrayal. The flowers weren't just evolving, they were adapting, learning. As they burst out of the station into the open air, Richard turned to Lila, his face pale. "This isn't over," he said, his voice shaking. "They're not just growing, they're hunting." The night had fallen like a shroud, blanketing the ruins in impenetrable darkness. Richard and Lila moved swiftly through the overgrown streets, their breath visible in the cold air. The station was far behind them, but the weight of what they had seen lingered heavily in the silence. "We can't keep running," Lila said, breaking the quiet. Her voice was steady, despite the fear Richard knew she felt. "They're everywhere. What's the point?" Richard slowed his pace, turning to face her. In the pale moonlight, her face looked older than it should have. Too many scars, too much fear for someone so young. "We don't have a choice," he said. "If we stop, we die." "But what if there's no way to stop them?" Lila's voice cracked, a mix of desperation and anger. "You said it yourself. This is your mess. Shouldn't you fix it? Her words cut deeper than any blade, but Richard didn't let it show. Instead, he turned away, his jaw tightening. I'm trying, he muttered. That's all I can do. They walked in silence until they reached a crumbling overpass. Richard scanned the area, his instincts honed over years of survival. The faint glow of flowers in the distance sent a shiver down his spine. We'll camp here for the night, he said, motioning to a sheltered corner beneath the overpass. As Lila settled in, Richard sat with his back against the cold concrete, his rifle resting across his knees. The events of the day replayed in his mind: the flowers, the station, Dr. Hensley's twisted form. He closed his eyes, hoping for a moment's reprieve, but the darkness offered no comfort. Instead, a memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. Years ago, the lab was pristine, its walls a stark white that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights. Richard stood in the observation room, his arms crossed as he watched the experiment unfold. Dr. Hensley was there too, her sharp eyes fixed on the monitor. This could change everything, she said, her voice tinged with excitement. Think about it: regeneration, enhanced cognition, immunity to disease. We could make humanity stronger. Richard frowned, uneasy. It's too fast. We don't know what this could do in the long term. Hensley waved a dismissive hand. Progress requires risk, Richard. You know that. He did know, but something about the way the flowers reacted, the way their petals quivered, as if alive, made his stomach turn. What if it adapts, becomes something we can't control? Hensley smiled, a cold, calculating expression. Then we adapt faster. Richard's eyes snapped open, his chest heaving. He glanced at Leela, who was fast asleep, curled up beneath her tattered blanket. The guilt gnawed at him like a living thing. He had known even then, but he hadn't done enough to stop it. A faint rustling pulled him from his thoughts. He tensed, gripping his rifle, his eyes scanning the shadows. The sound came again, closer this time. He rose to his feet, motioning for Leela to stay quiet. She woke with a start, her eyes wide with fear. Stay here, he whispered. Richard stepped into the open, his heart pounding. The sound grew louder, mix of footsteps and voices. He froze as two figures emerged from the darkness, their faces gaunt but unmistakably human. They weren't infected. Don't shoot, one of them said, raising his hands. We're not here to fight. Richard didn't lower his rifle. Then what do you want? The man hesitated, glancing at his companion. We heard what you found at the station, he said, and we know what you're looking for. Richard's grip tightened. How? Because we've been looking for the same thing, the man replied. And if you don't want the flowers to win, you're going to need us. Richard's finger hovered over the trigger, his eyes fixed on the two strangers. They stood at a safe distance, hands raised in a show of surrender. The taller one, a man in his late 30s, with hollow cheeks and a tired expression, spoke. Again, you've seen it, haven't you? He said, his voice calm but firm. What they're becoming. Richard didn't respond immediately. His instincts screamed at him not to trust them, but there was something in the man's tone and urgency that felt genuine. Beside him, the second figure, a young woman, shifted nervously. Her face was streaked with dirt, but her sharp eyes darted between Richard and Lila. You know what's out there, the man continued, and you know you can't face it alone. Start talking, Richard said finally, his rifle steady. Who are you, and how do you know about the station? The man nodded, lowering his hands slowly. My name's Aaron, he said. This is Sam. We've been tracking the flowers for years, trying to understand them. When we heard about the station, we thought maybe there were answers there. Richard's jaw tightened. There weren't. Not the ones you wanted, Aaron said, his gaze steady. But the flowers are changing, evolving, and if we don't stop them now, there won't be anyone left to try. Lila stepped forward, her voice trembling. How do we stop them? Is there even a way? Aaron hesitated, glancing at Sam. The younger woman crossed her arms, her expression grim. There might be, she said, but it's not easy. The flowers, they're like a hive. They share information, communicate. If we can disrupt that connection, we might be able to slow them down, or stop them completely, Aaron added. But we need to get to the source. The source, Richard echoed, his tone sharp. And where exactly is that? Aaron sighed, his shoulders slumping. Deep in the quarantine zone, there's a facility bigger than the station. It's where the first experiments were conducted. Richard's stomach churned. He knew exactly where Aaron was talking about. The facility was a place he had tried to forget, a place where he had watched things spiral out of control. It's suicide, he said flatly. That place is overrun. We don't have a choice, Aaron said. If we don't try, the flowers will spread beyond anything we can contain. They're already hunting, learning. It's only a matter of time before they take everything. Richard's grip on his rifle tightened. He looked at Leela, who was staring at him with wide, questioning eyes. She didn't say anything, but her expression spoke volumes. Fine, Richard said at last. But if this goes south, we're getting out. No heroics. Aaron nodded. Fair enough. The group moved cautiously through the ruins, the weight of their decision hanging heavily over them. Richard kept Leela close, his eyes constantly scanning for movement. The streets grew quieter as they neared the quarantine zone, the air thicker with the sickly sweet scent of flowers as they approached the edge of the zone. A massive fence loomed before them, its metal warped and rusted. Beyond it, the ground was covered in a dense carpet of flowers, their petals glowing faintly in the dim light. The sight was both beautiful and horrifying. This is it, Aaron said, his voice low. Once we're in, there's no turning back. Richard glanced at Leela, her face pale but determined. He placed a hand on her shoulder. Stay close. Don't touch anything. They climbed the fence and dropped into the heart of the quarantine zone. The air felt heavier, almost oppressive, and the faint hum of the flowers filled the silence. As they moved deeper, the world seemed to shift. Shadows danced where there shouldn't be any, and the ground felt unnaturally warm. What is that? Lila whispered, pointing ahead. Richard followed her gaze and froze. In the distance, a massive structure loomed, its walls covered in pulsating vines. The flowers seemed to grow thicker as they approached, their petals quivering as if aware of their presence. The source, Aaron said grimly. Let's hope we're not too late. The air inside the quarantine zone was different, thicker, almost alive. Every breath felt weighted, the faint scent of the flowers growing stronger with each step. Richard led the group cautiously, his rifle steady, his eyes darting to every shadow. Behind him, Lila stayed close, her hands trembling, but her steps resolute. The massive structure loomed ahead, its walls covered in pulsating vines and shimmering flowers. The vines seemed to move subtly, as though they were breathing. The faint hum they had heard earlier had grown louder, resonating in their chests like a low, steady drumbeat. This isn't natural, Leela whispered, her voice trembling. It's like they're alive. They are, Aaron said grimly, his gaze fixed on the structure. And they know we're here. Richard stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, cracks filled with vines that writhed subtly, as if reacting to their presence. He knelt down, examining one of the cracks. They're spreading faster than I thought, he muttered. We don't have much time. What do you mean? Sam asked, her tone sharp. I mean this place won't stay contained for long, Richard replied. If we don't stop this now, it's over. Aaron nodded, his jaw tightening. Then we move quickly. The core should be in the central chamber. As they approached the structure, the hum grew deafening. The entrance was a gaping hole in the wall, vines curling around the edges like a mouth waiting to devour them. Richard glanced back at Leela, her face pale but determined. Stay close, he said. his voice firm. No matter what happens, don't touch anything. Lila nodded, gripping the straps of her backpack tightly. Together, they stepped into the darkness. Inside, the walls were alive. Vines twisted and pulsed, their movements synchronized with the steady hum. The air was warmer, almost suffocating, and the faint glow of the flowers cast eerie shadows across the floor. Richard's grip on his rifle tightened. "This place is a tomb," Sam muttered, her voice barely audible. "No," Aaron said, his eyes scanning the walls. "It's a hive." They moved deeper into the structure, the hum growing louder with each step. The corridors twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the heart of the building. Richard's mind raced, memories of the experiments flashing before his eyes. He had been here before, but it was unrecognizable now, consumed by the very thing they had created. Finally, they reached a massive chamber. The walls were covered in flowers, their petals quivering as though in anticipation. In the center of the room stood a massive, pulsating mass of vines and petals, its glow almost blinding. The hum was deafening now, vibrating in their bones. "The core," Aaron said, his voice barely audible over the noise. Richard stared at the mass, his stomach churning. It was alive, pulsing like a heartbeat, and he could feel it watching them. He took a step forward, his rifle raised. "Wait," Sam said, grabbing his arm. "We don't know what it'll do if we attack it." Richard shook her off. "We don't have a choice." But before he could fire, the mass shifted. A figure emerged from the vines, its body grotesquely twisted, but vaguely human. Richard froze as the figure stepped forward, its face partially obscured by the flowers growing from its skull. It spoke. "You came back," it said, its voice a haunting mix of human and something else. "I knew you would." Richard's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. "Hensley," he whispered. The figure tilted its head, the flowers on its body quivering. "You abandoned us," it said. "Left us to die. But we didn't die, Richard. We became something more." Richard's grip on his rifle faltered. "This isn't life," he said, his voice shaking. "This is a nightmare." Hensley laughed, a sound that echoed through the chamber. "Nightmares are for the weak," she said. "We've transcended, and soon, so will you." The vines around the room began to move, creeping toward the group. Richard raised his rifle, his heart pounding. "Get ready to run," he said, his voice barely steady. "This isn't over." The vines surged toward them like living snakes, their movements deliberate and calculated. Richard fired a shot, the echo deafening in the massive chamber. The bullet tore through the nearest vine, but it didn't stop. More sprouted from the walls, the floor, the very air around them. "Move," Richard shouted, pulling Lila back as the vines reached for her. Aaron and Sam scrambled to avoid the writhing mass, their faces pale with fear. Hensley, or what remained of her, stood in the center of the chaos, her twisted form pulsating with the rhythm of the flowers. "You can't stop it," she said, her voice resonating through the chamber. "You can only join it." Richard's mind raced. The core, the massive, pulsating structure at the heart of the room, was the key. If they could destroy it, maybe, just maybe, they could stop the spread. But getting to it meant going through Hensley and the vines. "We need to hit the core," he shouted over the chaos. "It's the only way." Aaron nodded, his face grim. "How?" "I'll distract her," Richard said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "You and Sam focus on the core. Lilast, with me." "No," Lala protested, her voice breaking. "You'll get yourself killed." Richard turned to her, his expression softening. "I'll be fine," he lied. "Just trust me." Before she could argue, he charged forward, his rifle blazing. The vines recoiled briefly, but they were relentless. Hensley watched him, her head tilted, as if amused. "You're still fighting," she said, "even after everything." "Why?" Because I'm human, Richard growled, and we don't quit. Hensley laughed, the sound unnatural and grating. Humanity is obsolete. You cling to your weakness, your pain. We've evolved beyond it. Richard didn't answer. He fired another shot, aiming for her chest. The bullet struck, but the flowers absorbed the impact, quivering briefly before regaining their composure. Hensley stepped closer, her vines reaching for him. Meanwhile, Aaron and Sam circled the room, dodging the vines as they closed in on the core. Sam pulled out a small explosive device from her pack, her hands shaking as she armed it. "This is to work," she muttered. Aaron covered her, slashing at the vines with a rusted machete. "Hurry," he yelled, his voice strained. Leela stood frozen, her eyes darting between Richard and the others. The fear in her chest was suffocating, but something else was there, too, a spark of determination. She grabbed a piece of broken metal from the ground and ran toward Richard. "Lila, no," he shouted, but it was too late. She swung the metal at the vines, cutting through them with surprising strength. For a brief moment, they had a clear path. "Go," she yelled. "Get to the core." Richard hesitated, his heart pounding. He didn't want to leave her, but there was no time to argue. He sprinted toward the center of the room. Joining Aaron and Sam, Sam planted the explosive at the base of the core, her fingers trembling as she set the timer. 30 seconds, she shouted. "We need to get out of here." The vines lashed out, faster and more aggressive now. One wrapped around Aaron's leg, dragging him to the ground. He screamed, slashing at it desperately. "Richard?" Leela's voice was sharp, filled with panic. He turned to see her struggling against the vines, her small frame engulfed by the writhing mass. "No," Richard roared, running toward her. He fired his rifle until it clicked empty, then used it as a club, smashing at the vines with all his strength. "Go," she screamed. "You have to go. I'm not leaving you," he shouted back, his voice breaking. The timer on the explosive ticked down. 10-9, ... 8, ... Aaron managed to free himself, stumbling toward the exit. "Richard," he yelled, "it's going to blow." Richard grabbed Lila's arm, pulling her free, just as the core let out a deafening roar. The vines convulsed violently, their movements erratic and desperate. He pulled her toward the exit, his legs burning with effort. 5.4. 3. ... They dove through the opening, just as the explosion ripped through the chamber. The force of the blast threw them to the ground, a wave of heat and debris washing over them. For a moment, everything was silent. Aftermath. When Richard opened his eyes, the world was quiet again. The hum was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. He sat up slowly, his body aching, and looked around. Leela was next to him, her face streaked with dirt but alive. "You okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "You didn't leave me." Richard managed a faint smile. "I told you I wouldn't." Aaron and Sam appeared, battered but alive. The four of them stood in the ruins of the quarantine zone. The flowers around them wilted and lifeless. The core was destroyed, but the cost was written on all their faces. "This isn't over," Aaron said, his voice heavy. "The flowers ... they're just one part of it. There's more out there." Richard looked at Leela, her small hand gripping his tightly. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: they would face it together. The air was still heavy with the scent of ash and burnt vines. The once pulsating hive was now a collapsed ruin, its twisted flowers reduced to lifeless husks. Richard stood at the edge of the destruction, his rifle slung over his shoulder, staring at the crumbled remains of what had nearly consumed them. Lila sat a few feet away, her knees drawn to her chest, her face streaked with dirt and dried tears. She hadn't spoken much since the explosion. Her small hands fidgeted with the torn strap of her backpack, her gaze fixed on the ground. Aaron and Sam were gathering what little supplies they could salvage from their packs. Their expressions were grim, shadows of exhaustion and loss etched into their faces. The silence between them was deafening, broken only by the faint whistle of the wind. Richard finally turned to Leela, crouching down to meet her eye level. "You did good back there," he said softly. "Braver than most grown men I've met." She looked up at him, her lip trembling. "We destroyed it. But what if it's not enough?" Richard hesitated. He didn't have an answer, not one that would bring her the comfort she needed. "We did what we could," he said finally. "And sometimes, that has to be enough." Aaron approached, his movements slow and deliberate. "We bought time," he said, his voice low. "But you're right, it's not over. The flowers may be dormant here, but the spores, they could still be out there." Sam joined him, crossing her arms tightly. "It's only a matter of time before it starts again. If not here, then somewhere else." Richard exhaled sharply, the weight of their words settling heavily on his shoulders. "Then we keep moving," he said. "We find a way to stop it. For good." Aaron frowned. "You think there's a way?" Richard's gaze hardened. "There has to be." The group fell into a tense silence. The weight of their survival was a double-edged sword. Victory felt hollow when the fight was far from over. But Richard knew one thing: they had to keep going. For Leela, for whatever was left of humanity. 1 week later, the road stretched endlessly. Ahead, the ruins of the old world, a constant reminder of how far they had fallen. Richard walked at the front of the group, his steps steady but weary. Leela followed close behind, her small frame burdened by a pack almost too large for her. "Richard," she said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Do you think my dad would have been proud of me?" Richard stopped, turning to face her. The question hit him harder than he expected, a lump forming in his throat. He knelt down, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Lila," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I don't know your dad, but if he were anything like you, I know he'd be proud." More than proud. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and she nodded, a small, trembling smile forming on her lips. "Thanks." He stood, ruffling her hair lightly. "Come on, we've got a long way to go." As they continued down the road, the faint sound of birdsong broke the oppressive silence. It was a small thing, almost insignificant, but to Richard, it felt like a promise, a reminder that life, even in its smallest forms, endured. The flowers weren't gone, and the fight wasn't over. But in that moment, with Lila walking beside him, and the horizon stretching endlessly ahead, Richard felt something he hadn't in years. Hope, asterisk, asterisk, final note. Their story closes with the sense that the struggle continues, but so does humanity's resilience. Richard and Lila's bond becomes the emotional heart of the story, while the flowers remain a lingering threat, ensuring the world feels alive and uncertain.